Hey everyone, and welcome back to another long, slow dive into the oddly comforting secrets of the past. Imagine an entire civilization operating without the tyrannical, ticking hand of a minute. For the overwhelming majority of people who lived throughout the Middle Ages, time was not a number. It was a feeling. It was a texture. It was the quality of light falling across a freshly plowed field. It was certainly not an urgent deadline. The modern fixation on the second, on the tenth of a second, would have seemed like a bizarre, unnecessary psychological torment. The peasant in 12th century Europe did not own a clock. The concept of the minute, as we know it, a tiny, segmented fraction of an hour, simply didn't exist in their practical daily lexicon. Their relationship with the passage of the day was slow, communal, and profoundly imprecise. It was measured by two primary forces, the relentless natural rhythm of the sun and the loud, deliberate dictates of the local church. The natural clock was the most important. The working day stretched from dawn until dusk, meaning the summer work shift might last 16 exhausting hours, while the winter day could be a brisk 8. Work began when there was enough light to see the plow handles, and it ended when the shadows became too long and deep to trust the footing. There was no argument with this schedule. It was universal. The man-made schedule was anchored to the sound of the bell. For the common folk, for the people in the fields and the small, smoky hamlets, the day was structured by what were known as the canonical hours, sounded out by the parish priest ringing the church bell. These were the only formal, repeatable divisions of time that mattered. The bell would ring for matins, somewhere in the dead of night, long before true dawn. It rang for lauds as the light began to appear. Prime was the first official hour of the day, signaling the start of full labor. Then came the true markers of the day, terce, sext, and none. Sext, around modern noon, was one of the most important bells. It signaled a midday break, a time for the simple main meal of the day. But here is where the imprecision becomes immediately apparent. There was no mechanical clock setting the schedule. The priest merely rang the bell when the sun reached its highest, most prominent position in the sky. This point, solar noon, constantly drifts depending on the season and the geography. It's a fuzzy, relative concept. This is why historically, noon was a flexible designation. It was just sext. It meant the sun is high and the first major part of the day's labor is done. If one had asked a peasant what time it was, they wouldn't have checked a watch. They would have looked at the length of their own shadow, or they would have paused, head tilted, listening for the faint, deep chime of the church tower miles away. The biggest secret of medieval timekeeping is that it was deeply social. The time belonged to the village, not to the individual. Everyone heard the same bell. Everyone saw the same sun. If the priest was having a particularly busy or perhaps drowsy day, and he rang the bell for none an hour late, then the entire village broke for their late afternoon meal an hour late. The schedule was dictated by human action, not by cold, unfeeling gearwork. The working classes, especially artisans and tradesmen who needed slightly more precision, sometimes adopted a concept called points. A single point was roughly 15 minutes. This sounds more specific, but it wasn't measured by any device. It was an abstract division used primarily for calculating work contracts and wages. To say a job would take 3 points was just a slightly more granular way of saying it would take a little less than an hour. It was a gentleman's agreement, not an empirical measurement. This lack of urgency created a profoundly different psychological environment. The modern anxiety over wasted time or lost minutes simply didn't exist. Time wasn't something to be saved, it was something to be consumed entirely by the tasks at hand. There was no rush because the sun was going to set when it set, regardless of how quickly the harvest was brought in. Their schedule was non-negotiable, but the minutes within that schedule were entirely fluid. Being paid based on the daylight itself had serious consequences. When the days grew short in winter, the peasant lost a substantial portion of their working hours, and their effective income dropped. This wasn't laziness. It was the simple, practical economics of a world only lit by natural sources. The sun was the wage calculator. And so, life in the medieval hamlet simply moved at the pace of the slow-turning world. It was a rhythm set by the stomach demanding food, the moon demanding sleep, and the distant, heavy clang of the bell demanding prayer. They were not ruled by the stopwatch. They were ruled by the shadows. The day was a series of vast, generous windows, matins to prime, prime to sext, sext to none. The bell for Compline would eventually sound, marking the end of the day, a final call before the whole world became a matter of darkness and firelight. When the final chime faded, the time between one day and the next stretched out undefined until the bell for matins cut through the black silence once more. It was a beautiful, chaotic inefficiency that has been utterly and perhaps tragically forgotten. The medieval life was not lived in the present. It was lived in the now and the next, a rhythm of survival that felt less like a schedule and more like a breath. The medieval day, we now understand, unfolded at a flexible, communal pace, dictated by bells and shadows. But the internal life of the commoner, the constant, low-level war against fever, ache, and sudden injury, demanded a different kind of precision. The peasant wasn't fighting the clock. They were fighting invisible forces, and their local pharmacy was less a medicine cabinet and more a bizarre collection of items found in the ditch. There was no white lab coat, no controlled trials, and certainly no sterile environment. When illness struck, the local healer, often a wise woman, or simply a neighbor with slightly more confidence, turned to the only things they knew, the powerful properties of the earth and the desperate logic of metaphor. The core of medieval medicine, much like its diet, was the garden. A vast amount of folk knowledge existed concerning herbs. Chamomile for sleep, mint for upset stomachs, and comfrey for mending broken bones were staples. This herbal knowledge, passed down generationally, was remarkably effective in treating minor ailments. But when simple herbs failed, the remedies escalated quickly into the unsettlingly strange. Consider the application of mildew. Before penicillin was chemically isolated in the 20th century, medieval people had an empirical, if unscientific, understanding of its powers. For an infected wound, a peasant might press a slice of moldy bread directly onto the cut. This wasn't magic. It was a rough, unpredictable, and potentially life-saving application of an antibiotic. The effectiveness depended entirely on which type of mold had decided to colonize that particular piece of grain. It was a risky game of microbial roulette. But wait, it gets much stranger than moldy bread. The desperate search for cure often turned to the animal kingdom, fueled by a belief that something strong, strange, or even disgusting might combat the internal sickness. This is where the village pharmacy descended into a kind of low-grade horror show. For instance, the cure for a persistent cough might involve consuming a tea brewed from dried and powdered earthworms. The logic, perhaps, was that something that lived in the dark, damp earth must surely have the fortitude to banish a common chest cold. Or consider the remedy for the dreaded affliction of the eye, powdered toad. A toad, dried and ground into a fine dust, was believed to clear the vision.
If a modern physician suggested a dose of dried amphibian to cure an eye infection, the patient would, understandably, exit the room very quickly. In the medieval village, it was simply Tuesday. The role of superstition was just as vital as the medicinal components. The healing process was rarely purely physical. It required appeasing spiritual or magical forces. A fever wasn't just a physical spike in temperature. It was the result of bad air, a witch's curse, or perhaps a minor demon taking up temporary residence. Therefore, the prescription came with mandatory magical steps. For a serious illness, the cure might involve binding the afflicted limb with a special piece of linen while reciting a specific religious charm, often a garbled mix of Latin and local dialect. The physical remedy, the linen bandage, was inseparable from the spiritual one, the incantation. If the patient recovered, it was not the herb or the toad dust that received the credit, it was the power of the charm. If the patient died, it simply meant the demon was too strong or the charm was mispronounced. The use of urine, a substance always readily available, also found its place in the medieval cabinet. It wasn't just a cleaning agent. It was often used as an antiseptic for wounds or as a diagnostic tool. The color and consistency of the patient's urine were one of the few clues a healer had to the internal state of the body. This practice, while crude, was one of the earliest forms of diagnostic medicine. Urine was the poor man's chemical analysis kit. The line between medicine and kitchen supply was extremely blurry. Honey, a valuable and expensive commodity, was prized for its antiseptic properties long before modern science understood why. Vinegar, another kitchen staple, was thought to ward off the miasm or bad air that caused illness. In a sense, the peasant's survival kit was their pantry, forcing them to see every element of their environment as a potential cure or a potential poison. This low-tech medical world highlights the absolute resilience and sometimes the sheer desperation of the common folk. They were performing self-surgery, basic sanitation, and complex spiritual warfare all at once, usually with materials that had a shelf life of about 4 hours. The fact that any of them survived a severe illness is a quiet testament to the human body's capacity for self-repair, despite the best or worst efforts of their local pharmacy. The medieval patient rarely died from a single catastrophic failure. They often succumbed to a slow, cumulative series of infections that their moss and mildew could not defeat. Yet the remedies, strange as they were, offered something just as vital as a cure, the feeling of doing something. In a world with no options, a powdered toad was a desperate, tangible action against an invisible enemy. The village healer, with their basket of strange roots and their knowledge of half-remembered chants, held a terrifying, powerful place in the community. Their bizarre cabinet was the difference between life and death. The only question was whether the concoction was going to save you or simply give you something new to worry about while you waited for the fever to break.
The bizarre pharmacy of the medieval village showed a desperate ingenuity against physical pain. But the peasants' ingenuity was perhaps most consistently tested by the things they wore, a micro-history of textile endurance dictated by scarcity. Modern audiences are conditioned to think of clothing as disposable. A shirt might last a year, perhaps 2, before it is relegated to cleaning rags. For the medieval commoner, a tunic was a capital investment. It was a primary asset, second only to tools and livestock. The typical peasant possessed, on average, 2 outfits, a thick, heavy set for winter and a slightly thinner, still coarse set for summer. And these garments were expected to survive. They were expected to outlive children, marriages, and maybe even a few landlords. The fabric of choice was almost universally wool. While linen was prized for undergarments because it could theoretically be boiled clean, the outer garments that faced the mud, the sweat, and the endless friction of manual labor were woven from the most durable, readily available material: raw, undyed, heavy wool. It was scratchy, it retained moisture, and it smelled distinctly of sheep, smoke, and old earth. It was also nearly indestructible. To appreciate the lifespan of a peasant's tunic, one must understand that it was not merely a piece of apparel. It was a textile project perpetually in progress. A tunic was not worn until it ripped. It was worn until it could no longer be patched. When a tear appeared, the woman of the house did not discard the garment. She carefully harvested thread from an older, more dilapidated piece of cloth and stitched a patch over the hole. This process, repeated hundreds of times, meant that by the end of its life, a 5-year-old tunic was less a single garment and more a dense, multi-layered collage of patches, each one telling a small story of a repair done in firelight. The concept of laundry, as we know it, a weekly cycle of machine washing and scented detergents, did not exist. The sheer difficulty of cleaning these dense wool garments meant washing was a rare, intense, and socially significant event. It was not something undertaken lightly or alone. The peasant's method for washing was less about hygiene and more about removing the visible accumulation of dirt and grease. Water itself was the first problem. Hauling enough water to soak a single wool tunic was arduous work. The cleaning agents, however, are what truly define the era's approach to sanitation. Soap, when available, was a coarse, homemade mixture of boiled animal fat and wood ash lye. It was harsh on the skin and rough on the fabric, but it cut through the heavy farm grime. But wait, for a powerful degreaser, a shortcut was often taken that turns the modern stomach: stale human urine. Stored urine, rich in ammonia, was an extremely effective and readily available cleansing agent. The peasant often soaked their linen undergarments, the few things that were washed slightly more often, in a solution of collected urine before rinsing them in a local stream or pond. It was a highly practical, if deeply unpleasant, chemical process that allowed the cloth to be worn again. Because the garments were so vital, they were passed down the family line. A tunic might start its life on the tallest adult male, and as it inevitably shrank, frayed, and accumulated patches, it would be cut down, re-sewn, and passed to a younger child. The same piece of wool might serve a father, then a son, then be completely dismantled and re-sewn into leggings or a cap. The fabric was worked until it physically disintegrated into short, unusable fibers. There was zero textile waste in the medieval village. Every scrap mattered. The clothes also served as a surprisingly effective status marker even within the common class. The simple presence of a clean, unpatched linen undershirt signaled a degree of industriousness, or perhaps a small amount of saved income. Dyes were another luxury. The common, everyday garment was often the undyed, dull gray-brown of the natural wool. Any garment with a distinct, deep color, a dark blue, a faded red, was a noticeable, proud expense, marking the wearer as slightly more elevated than the truly destitute. The relationship between the peasant and their clothing was one of intimate, constant proximity. These garments were not simply covering the body, they were sheltering it, defining it, and absorbing the entire physical history of the wearer. They carried the scent of the hearth, the soil of the fields, and the faint, unsettling chemical signature of lye and ammonia. When that rare moment came to put on a freshly washed, rough-dried piece of linen, it must have been a small, fleeting luxury. But the outer tunic, the real horsework, was always there, heavy and familiar, a constant layer of rough wool that was a historical testament to textile economy. It was a garment built for work, not for comfort, and it simply kept going, one patch at a time. The quiet resilience of the commoner was literally stitched into the fabric they wore.
The peasant's clothing was a testament to resilience, a patched-up monument to resourcefulness. But even a garment made of the finest, scratchiest wool cannot sustain a person. Survival, ultimately, came down to the stomach, and the medieval diet was a monotonous, high-carb commitment to endurance. For the commoner, food was not a source of pleasure or variety, it was fuel, and the source of that fuel was almost entirely grain. The medieval meal was defined by the great, weighty presence of bread. It was the centerpiece, the plate, and often the utensil. Forget the image of a soft, airy, artisanal sourdough. The peasant's bread was a hard, dense, dark creation made primarily of rye, barley, or a mix of tougher grains known as maslin. Wheat, the grain we now associate with bread, was a luxury reserved for the upper classes or specific religious festivals. This bread was consumed in enormous volumes. A working man might eat 2 or 3 pounds of it per day. Imagine the sheer, jaw-aching density of a 3-pound loaf of heavy barley bread. It was less a food item and more a dietary weapon. Its coarse texture, high fiber content, and sheer mass were necessary to sustain the brutal physical labor demanded by the fields. But this bread was merely the foundation. The second pillar of the medieval diet was the potage. This was a thick, slow-cooked stew, perpetually simmering over the hearth. It was the ultimate embodiment of resourcefulness, containing whatever scraps of vegetables, pulses, or herbs were available at the time. Peas, beans, onions, and cabbage formed the base, mixed with barley or oats to thicken it. The potage was rarely, if ever, made with meat. Meat was a precious commodity, usually reserved for the Lord's table or perhaps saved by a peasant family for a major feast day like Easter or Christmas. When meat did appear, it was often the tougher, less desirable parts of the animal, offal or the tough, stringy bits of a boar. The core of the potage was simple vegetable matter boiled down for hours until it was a digestible mush. For those dreaming of a clear, refreshing glass of water to wash down their dense meal, the medieval reality was quite different. The third and perhaps most defining element of the common diet was small beer. This was not the heady, alcoholic brew of a modern pub. Small beer had an alcohol content so low, often less than 1%, that it was safer than drinking the local water, which was frequently contaminated by waste, both human and animal. The brewing process involved boiling the water, which killed most of the pathogens. This meant that from dawn until dusk, from the toddler to the oldest farmhand, small beer was the primary beverage. It was served with breakfast, during the midday break, and again at the evening meal. The medieval person was essentially running on a constant, low-grade infusion of carbohydrates and residual yeast. They survived the waterborne diseases of the age by staying moderately hydrated with very weak, very watery grain alcohol. The great psychological weight of this diet was its monotony. The menu rarely changed. Day after day, it was the potage, the heavy bread, and the small beer. The only change came with the shifting seasons and the success of the harvest. A good harvest meant the potage was slightly thicker. A bad harvest meant the bread was bulked out with filler like dried peas or even sawdust, and the constant, cold whisper of scarcity began to grow louder. The concept of a balanced diet was, of course, entirely unknown. Medieval peasants were often physically robust, but nutritionally fragile. They suffered from constant parasitic infections, and the lack of protein, vitamins, and minerals led to chronic illnesses that were simply accepted as part of the daily struggle. They were strong from the constant exertion, but their resilience could be instantly undermined by a simple infection or a single spoiled meal. The table itself was a communal affair. Food was often eaten directly from a shared trencher, a large slice of stale bread, or a wooden plate with fingers or a personal knife. Manners, by modern standards, were pragmatic and direct. Food was the ultimate resource, and wasting it was an unthinkable transgression. The The scraps from the meal, even the soaked bread trencher, were often fed to the dogs or kept for the next day's potage base. The daily loaf and the endless potage were a constant, tangible reminder of their social station. They were literally eating the landscape. It was a life lived on the razor's edge of survival, where the abundance of a good summer was immediately contrasted by the deep, terrifying uncertainty of a long winter. The entire civilization sat on a mountain of carbohydrates, hoping the weather would hold for one more growing season. The silent, ever-present reality was that a few weeks of heavy rain or a sudden late frost could instantly turn the monotonous meal into a life-ending famine. Their daily fare was a constant act of hope, a heavy, dark crust broken in silent prayer that tomorrow's harvest would simply be enough.
The relentless monotony of the medieval diet was only occasionally broken by a lucky feast or a meager bit of foraged meat, but the relationship with animals went far beyond the plate. They were assets, co-workers, and bizarrely, occasionally defendants in a court of law. This is not a metaphor. This is not folklore. Between the 13th and 18th centuries, primarily in France, Switzerland, and Germany, a very real, very unsettling legal practice existed: the judicial trial of animals. For the modern mind, the idea of a pig standing trial for murder is utterly absurd. But in the medieval mind, law and morality were profoundly entwined with a literal interpretation of biblical scripture. If an animal caused harm, if a pig mauled a child or a swarm of caterpillars destroyed a vineyard, it was viewed through a spiritual and legal lens. The prevailing belief was that the animal was acting not just on instinct, but possibly under demonic influence, or was simply guilty of an earthly crime. The records for these trials are meticulously documented, offering a bizarrely detailed window into the legal system of the era. The most common defendants were farm animals, pigs, cows, and horses, accused of homicide, usually involving the death of a human child. Take the case of the sow of Savigny in 1457. This is perhaps the most famous example. A sow, caught in the act of attacking and killing a 5-year-old child, was arrested. She was not summarily executed by the angry villagers. She was processed through the full legal system. First, the sow was formally indicted. A human lawyer was appointed to represent her. The trial was held in the local courthouse with a magistrate presiding, and witnesses, human witnesses, were called to testify against the defendant. The sow, according to the records, was kept in a cell, often alongside human prisoners, while awaiting judgment. The proceedings were deadly serious. The defendant's legal representation would argue for leniency, citing lack of intent, or perhaps suggesting the owner was negligent. The prosecutor would emphasize the horror of the crime and the need for public atonement to appease God. The whole affair was costly, taking up valuable time and resources. In the case of the Savigny sow, the verdict was guilty. The sow was sentenced to death by hanging. The execution was carried out with full ceremony, often dressed in human clothes and hung from the public gallows. The spectacle served a dual purpose. It satisfied the demands of justice, and it was a horrifying moral lesson for the community. The act was meant to purify the community of the taint of the demonic or the unnatural crime. But pigs and cows were considered ex officio defendants, meaning they were under the jurisdiction of the secular court. A whole different and arguably stranger process was reserved for pests, rats, weevils, locusts, and caterpillars. These were under the jurisdiction of the ecclesiastical court, the church. When a field was devastated by a plague of insects, the community would bring a case against the entire species. The official process involved a formal summons issued by the bishop, commanding the pests to appear in court. An advocate was appointed to speak on behalf of the insects, often arguing with the creatures were merely fulfilling their natural role as God's creatures, or that they had nowhere else to go. The church court would then pass sentence, which usually took the form of excommunication. The insects, officially deemed unrepentant and disobedient to the church, were ritually cursed and excommunicated from the Christian community. The irony here is profound. The court was essentially applying the harshest spiritual punishment, damnation, to animals that almost certainly did not understand the concept of a soul. The trials, however strange, were never arbitrary acts of madness. They were a deeply logical outcome of the medieval worldview, where every event, from a good harvest to a pig biting, was seen as part of a divine moral order. Justice had to be seen to be done, even if the defendant was a rodent. The trials offered a crucial psychological outlet. They created a structure, a process, a sense of control over a chaotic and often terrifying world where fate seemed entirely random. By putting the animal on trial, the community was declaring that even the beast was subject to the immutable rules of their justice system. The records of these animal trials faded away as legal philosophy evolved, making them a peculiar footnote in the history of law. But the sheer historical fact remains. There was a period when a medieval lawyer could legitimately spend a week arguing that a rat swarm was simply misunderstood. It stands as one of the great, unsettling absurdities of the age. The only thing more shocking than the crimes the animals committed was the meticulous, deadly seriousness with which they were judged.
The judicial severity applied to errant animals highlights the medieval world's desperate need for order. But while they tried to control external chaos with bizarre lawsuits, the daily interior life of the commoner was defined by an entirely different, inescapable kind of chaos, the air itself. The modern focus on indoor air quality is a luxury. For the medieval peasant, the air inside their small single-room dwelling was a thick, complex, and pungent cocktail of necessity and negligence. To fully understand the medieval experience, one must let go of the concept of a clean break between the house and the farm, between the personal and the environmental. The core problem was the hearth. In most peasant homes, particularly those before the 15th century, the fireplace did not feature a chimney. Chimneys were a costly, complex architectural feature reserved for castles and monasteries. The common dwelling had an open fire pit, or hearth, placed centrally on the dirt or stone floor. The fire was the lifeline. It provided heat, it cooked the pottage, and it offered a feeble source of light. But there was no efficient escape for the smoke. It simply drifted. The house was designed with a hole in the roof called a smoke hole, intended to let the majority of the fumes escape. In practice, this system was disastrously inefficient. The smoke hole, meant to vent the carbon monoxide and particulates, usually allowed the smoke to linger, fill the room, and cling to everything inside. The consequence was an atmosphere permanently infused with the acrid, heavy smell of burning wood and turf. The visible effect was the dark, permanent soot that coated the inside of the roof, the walls, and the few pieces of furniture. Everything within the house was smoked. This constant exposure to wood smoke, a known irritant and carcinogen, would have resulted in pervasive eye infections, chronic coughs, and sadly, likely shortened lifespans. It was a silent, slow killer that was simply the price of warmth. But the air quality issues did not end with the smoke. The second major contributor to the unique indoor aroma was the constant, non-negotiable presence of domestic animals. The medieval peasant was deeply rational about heat. Their livestock, the piglet, the chickens, the ox, or the lamb, were often brought inside, particularly during the coldest winter months. This was not for sentimental reasons, it was a matter of survival. The animals' body heat helped keep the one-room cottage warm, and keeping them inside protected valuable assets from thieves and wolves. The consequence, however, was a constant supply of animal waste, dander, and general farmyard musk mingling with the wood smoke. The ground floor of a peasant's home was not a living room. It was a poorly ventilated, multi-species stable. Then there was the human element. Personal hygiene was sparse.
The heavy wool clothes were rarely washed, and baths were infrequent and laborious events. The air inside held the accumulated scent of unwashed bodies, stale sweat, and damp, heavy wool, all sealed in by a low, often windowless structure designed to keep out the cold, not to refresh the oxygen. The air also carried the complex aroma of the daily diet. It was perpetually thick with the smell of the ever-simmering pottage, the yeast and grain of the small beer, and the occasional brief smell of cooking grease. These were not the comforting smells of home. They were the heavy, unmoving, and entirely enveloping sense of human and animal cohabitation. The modern visitor, if they could somehow step through time into a medieval hovel, would be immediately overwhelmed by this olfactory assault. The indoor environment was a biological and chemical soup, dominated by smoke, animal ammonia, and uncirculated air. It was a condition that the inhabitants were, out of necessity, entirely acclimated to. They simply could not smell the way we do now. Their sensory baseline was so high that they were likely immune to the worst of it. The very architecture of the home reflected this acceptance. Small doors, few or no true glass windows, and thick, low roofs were all deliberate features to retain every precious calorie of heat. They prioritized warmth and security over ventilation, a choice that made perfect sense in an age defined by extreme weather and cold. The peasant knew the air was bad, but the cold was the immediate, tangible enemy. The smoke-filled room, with its damp earth floor and low ceiling, was a quiet monument to a brutal set of priorities. It was a space that was dark, crowded, and perpetually smoky, a necessary compromise where survival superseded comfort. The constant presence of the hearth fire did offer one small, overlooked benefit. The heavy smoke, by coating everything in soot, offered some degree of insect and pest control, a small, accidental victory in the constant low-level war against medieval filth. The peasant was living, quite literally, inside a gigantic smoky kiln, and the air was simply another, unavoidable challenge of the age.
The thick, smoky air of the peasant's cottage was the constant backdrop to a life defined by physical exhaustion. The brutal cycle of farming, the sun-up to sundown labor, the heavy bread diet, the rough wool clothes, demanded an occasional, vital pressure release. In a world where the working week was 6 demanding days, the medieval vacation was less a trip to the coast and more a sudden, explosive burst of communal joy sanctioned by the church. These moments of respite were known as feast days or holy days, and they were the most vibrant, anticipated marks on the calendar. Work stopped entirely. Tools were laid down. The urgency of time, that flexible medieval concept, was momentarily suspended. These holidays were not just for religious observance. They were a necessary economic function, ensuring the laborers did not simply collapse from chronic overwork. The number of holidays varied by region and era, but it was surprisingly large, perhaps 50 or more days a year, not counting Sundays. Many were minor saints' days, marked by a simple mass, but the truly significant breaks were the major festivals, Christmas, Easter, and particularly the local wake or patron saint's day. These were multi-day events, a sudden and profound injection of pleasure and temporary indulgence into the hard, gray routine. The moment labor ceased, the village turned its attention to 2 primary activities, ritual and revelry. The church service was mandatory, of course. It provided the official justification for the day off. But immediately following the solemn Mass, the atmosphere shifted completely. The focus moved from the divine to the deliciously earthly. The first essential component of any proper medieval holiday was ale. The small beer that sustained the peasant during the week gave way to something richer, stronger, and more intoxicating. For these specific festivals, the brewmasters, often the women of the village, would tap the best, most recently brewed, full-strength ale. This stronger brew provided the necessary social lubrication and mental escape, turning a group of exhausted laborers into a boisterous, laughing community. The food also saw a drastic upgrade. Since these holidays were often tied to seasonal abundance,
They were a rare opportunity for meat consumption. A pig might be slaughtered, a goose roasted, or a collection of chickens sacrificed for the communal pot. While the majority of the meal was still bread and pottage, the presence of real, dense roasted meat was an event to savor, a brief, luxurious relief from the endless grain. The rest of the day was filled with simple, vigorous communal games and organized chaos. Forget professional sports. The medieval holiday featured folk football, a notoriously violent and unstructured precursor to the modern game. Villages would play neighboring villages, often across miles of open field, with hundreds of participants, few rules, and plenty of broken bones. It was a raw, physical release of the pent-up stress of the working year. There were also wrestling matches, foot races, and archery contests, particularly in England, where the crown mandated archery practice. These contests provided a stage for local bragging rights and temporary celebrity. The prize was usually a barrel of ale, a ribbon, or simply the honor of the win, which was perhaps the most valuable reward of all. But for the commoner, the most vital aspect of the holiday was the storytelling. With no books, no mass media, and no electricity, the oral tradition was the key to entertainment. As the strong ale flowed and the fire warmed the gathered crowds, the local storyteller or traveling bard took center stage. They recounted religious parables, sure, but they also delivered thrilling tales of knights, ridiculous local gossip, and long, epic poems of saints and heroes. These were not quiet, polite recitations. They were loud, interactive performances, filled with audience participation, jokes, and dramatic pauses. This was the peasants' television, cinema, and theater all rolled into one communal experience, providing the necessary mental escape from the immediate struggle of the farm. The feasts were also a critical economic and social hub. They were the primary opportunity for courtship, for negotiating small debts, and for the entire population to reaffirm its structure outside the rigid hierarchy of the working week. The sheer fact of everyone wearing their best, and still likely quite rough clothing, eating the best available food, and drinking the strongest ale, created a profound sense of shared identity and temporary equality. The break was always temporary. The stronger ale meant many days began with a communal hangover, but by the first bell for prime, the tools were back in hand and the heavy wool tunics were back in the fields. The brief, chaotic joy of the holiday was over. But these sacred breaks were the psychological engine of the medieval world. They were the scheduled moments of irrational fun, the necessary rupture in the monotonous chain of labor. The memory of the roasted pig, the strength of the ale, and the punchline of the storyteller's joke were the mental reserves that allowed the peasant to endure the long, dark, smoky days until the next improbable vacation arrived. The feast days didn't just save the year, they saved the will to survive it.
The joyous chaos of the feast day was a bright, brief flash in the calendar, a moment where the heavy cloak of labor was lifted by ale and storytelling. But once the festivities concluded and the sun dipped below the horizon, the most profound and unyielding economic reality of the medieval world reasserted itself: the simple, miserable cost of light. For the vast majority of commoners, life did not merely slow down at dusk, it essentially stopped. This wasn't a choice based on leisure, it was a non-negotiable economic mandate enforced by darkness. To light the night required fuel, and fuel was expensive, smoky, and inefficient. The medieval aristocracy and the wealthy church had access to beeswax candles. Beeswax was the pinnacle of medieval illumination. It burned cleanly, produced a bright, pleasant light, and emitted a sweet, slightly honeyed smell. Because it required extensive labor and was a byproduct of apiculture, it was a profound luxury, a status symbol that signaled wealth and refinement. A nobleman could read, write, or gamble long into the evening under a clean, steady glow. The peasant could not. The illumination of the common household was sourced from two far grimier alternatives: tallow candles and rush lights. Tallow, derived from rendered animal fat, was the poor man's wax. It was readily available, usually sourced from sheep or cattle fat, making it an affordable byproduct of the occasional slaughter. But tallow came with significant drawbacks. It burned unevenly, casting a weak, flickering yellow light. Worse, it produced copious amounts of black soot, adding another layer to the already smoky cottage air. And most famously, it smelled quite distinctly of scorched animal grease. The smell was pervasive, clinging to the clothes and hair of those near it. It was the smell of necessity. Even more common, because it was virtually free, was the rushlight. This ingenious, deeply simple device was the cheapest form of light known to the medieval world. It was made by peeling the outer layer of a common rush, a wetland plant, leaving the spongy pith inside. This pith was then soaked in fat or grease, often the same animal tallow or kitchen drippings. The rushlight was not so much a candle as it was a piece of slow-burning oily rope. Held in a specialized holder, it produced a meager, smoky, guttering flame, less a light source and more a marker of darkness. It could barely illuminate a few feet around the user. It was essentially an economic compromise, a way to see just enough to avoid stepping on a sleeping animal or to safely climb onto the sleeping pallet. The simple economics meant that any activity requiring good light, reading, writing, delicate sewing, or complex repairs, was strictly limited to the hours of daylight. Education and literacy suffered because the expense of candles easily outstripped the peasants' ability to pay. Only the elite could afford to extend their intellectual day past sunset. For the common folk, darkness meant bedtime. The average family would only light a single tallow candle or rushlight for a short period after the evening meal. This brief interlude was usually dedicated to simple, communal activities, perhaps a final quiet round of knot tying, rough carving, or mending a large tear in the heavy wool garment. The cost of the tallow, even the cheap, smelly kind, was too high to justify extensive evening work. Every minute the light burned was a minute of melted fat that could not be sold, or worse, a tiny fraction of tomorrow's stored food supply. The constant low-level illumination also contributed to a profound change in the sleep cycle. Without artificial light to push back the dark, medieval society was effectively biphasic. People generally went to sleep shortly after compline, when the tallow was extinguished, around 8 or 9 p.m. They would then wake up after midnight for a period of an hour or two. The first sleep was over. This waking period, the watch, was quiet time in the dark, often spent praying, reflecting, or simply tending to the fire before returning for a second sleep until dawn. This fractured sleep pattern was a direct, practical result of the lack of light, a biological rhythm perfectly adapted to a world where only the moon offered a reliable, free source of illumination. The dark was not just an absence of light, it was an active force, a powerful regulator of the medieval economy and social structure. It kept the commoner dependent on the daylight hours for work, reinforced their lack of access to educational pursuits, and determined their very sleep schedule. The peasant cottage, sealed against the cold and filled with the stench of tallow smoke, became a silent, necessary tomb of activity after sunset. The difference between the bright, beeswax-lit library of the Lord and the smoky, rushlight-dimmed hovel of the peasant was a stark, tangible representation of social class. Light was money, and money was power. And so the vast majority of the world settled into the deep, genuine darkness of the medieval night, waiting for the bell for matins to cut through the silence, signaling the return of the sun and the renewal of their daylight labor. Their quiet hours were spent not in study, but in rest, conserving the energy for another day defined by shadows. The dark simply won. The peasant extinguished the tallow, and the day became a slow, quiet field where even dreams felt thin and fleeting.